over the last many days and weeks now, the Western media has been feeding this particular narrative, saying that war is imminent. It was almost like a weather forecast, if not tomorrow, then in the next few days, and so on. But what happened in the last several odd hours is that not a single bullet was fired, no military ground offensive on the part of Russia, but a move to recognize the eastern region of Ukraine as independent, as Putin said in his televised address about 10 or 11 hours ago. What did you make of Putin's justification for this move, given the fact that Russia has been making three principal demands? One, that NATO not expand any further. Two, to remove their strike forces from certain countries in Eastern Europe. And three, NATO go back to its status as was in vogue in 1997, after which, she says, at least 14 countries have been added to the NATO. So clearly, Russia thinks and Putin thinks that it has enough reasons to justify what it did several hours ago. What did you make of Russia's response? And also, is the West's response predictable so far, including the use of threat of sanctions? Professor Singh?
Thank you, Ramesh. Justification that Russia has, and that justification is in continuity even before President Putin came to power in the last 20 plus years. Russia has always maintained its security vis-a-vis Western forces or NATO in building buffers around it. So for a long time, we saw Soviet Union had entire Eastern Bloc as a buffer between Soviet Union and NATO. And Russia has been trying to ensure that there is some kind of buffer that stays between NATO and Russia. And this whole eastward expansion of NATO has been virtually thinning out that buffer, which is how psychologically Russians look at ensuring their security against Western forces. So what is happening here is that as Ukraine begins to be entertained, cultivated, co-opted into potentially joining NATO or European Union, Russia is looking at carving out part of Ukraine, which is then going to be really a small buffer between potentially a NATO member, Ukraine, and the eastern part of Donbass, which is where these two, LPR and DPR, are now formally recognized by President Putin, and potentially they are going to invite forces. You heard the Ukraine ambassador in UN Security Council intentionally saying additional Russian forces are going to come into these two so-called republics, which means, according to Kyiv, Russia has always been present there since 2014. So interesting it is that, with this enormous constant buildup of forces around Ukraine all these months, President Putin has successfully eroded, undermined the entire credibility of United States and increased disunity and invariance of perceptions and responses within NATO. So this whole talk of a swift and effective response, severe and unbearable sanctions, is almost now beginning to look like President Donald Trump's 2017 speech of fire and fury. Which means that increasingly it looks like that West is not intending to militarily support Ukraine. All they're doing there is removing NATO's liaison office from Kyiv to Brussels, almost contemplating to move President Zelensky from Kyiv to Lviv in extreme western city. This is the NATO and Western response. And for sanctions, President Putin has also prepared about $600 billion of foreign exchange over a period of time to withstand the worst case scenario where he could be virtually disconnected from international financial institutions and markets. So in that sense, if you look at how President Putin has built up, I foresee this being only a repeat of what happened in Crimea, what happened in Moldova, Transnistria region, where again there are 1,000 plus peacekeeping forces of Russia sitting there. So what is happening here now is that definitely the LPR and DPR, so-called People's Republics, will now receive peacekeeping forces of President Putin. And you heard US ambassador in UN Security Council saying it's nonsense but never called it invasion. So Russia
Right.
is
Professor
in
Singh, if I can just come in quickly, if you will. No, not many people are familiar with the intricacies of the issues at hand here. And for their benefit, would you like to dwell a bit, if you will, on the import of what Russia has said and done? Putin says Russia, or he has begun the process, started the process of recognizing the Donbas region of eastern Ukraine as independent. Now, what does it mean here? Because you refer to Crimea and Moldova. In that context, unlike Crimea in 2014, he's not using the word annexation or including Donbas region in Russian territory. All he's saying for now is that we will recognize their independence. Now, does independence mean autonomy or independence as you and I understand it? What's the sense you're getting, and why do you think he has played a different hand in 2022, unlike the expectation in the several weeks running up to yesterday's event that Russia will actually invade Ukraine to gain more territory?
Ramesh, you made a very important distinction here of conversations since Minsk Agreement and Protocol of 2014-15, which was seeking autonomy, a conversation between Kiev and these breakaway regions. Now the conversation is independence. And distinction again between Crimea's annexation, quote unquote, and declaration of independence of Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics in the eastern Ukraine and western Russia is clearly different, because Crimea, we understand, has a naval base, is strategically extremely important for Russia to virtually take over and control. Whereas here, the LPR and DPR is going to be another buffer. And what is interesting here is that the rebel forces are not yet controlling the entire Donbas region. So Donbas region is actually bigger than what is physically in control of these two people's republics. So when peacekeeping forces come in from Russia on invitation to LPR and DPR, these two so-called people's republics, which are now put in as independent nations, will they be only restraining themselves to the ceasefire line between Ukrainian forces and the rebel forces, or are they going to go up to the claimed areas of entire Donbas region? In fact, people are even talking now that, push comes to shove, Russian forces could go as far as to the Dnipro River, which divides Ukraine from north to south, and could directly bring in this entire, 2/3 or 1/3 of the region of Ukraine. And that will connect Russia and give direct and free access to Crimea in the south also. So potentially Ukraine, interesting it is, Kiev could become another Berlin, because Kiev is on the Dnipro river here.
That's very interesting. Kiev could become another Berlin, says Professor Singh. Very interesting comments there. Professor Singh, I want to talk a bit, if you will, about India's response throughout the US-Russia tensions over Ukraine. Do you think it's balanced, considered, no knee-jerk reaction? India still treading the line that diplomacy can and should be given a chance, and that dialogue is the only way out, not military offensive or military action. What did you make of India's response in the UNSC open session just a few hours ago?
I think clearly initially there was a little bit of reluctance, but from 29th of January, abstaining from a resolution on Ukraine, India has been what I would describe as robust but nuanced and subdued response of talking about restraint and diplomacy. And we saw the same sentiment being repeated, which is in line with the historical evolution of India's foreign policy.
Right.
And also the current need to balance between friendship with United States and Russia. But Ramesh, what is interesting is China saying the same thing as India, requesting for restraint and dialogue, whereas after 4th February joint statement between President Putin and Xi Jinping, there was anticipation that China is going to openly back Russia in United Nations Security Council. That has not happened. And very quickly, let me also say the panic perhaps much more here in India. I have some academic friends in Kyiv. They don't see as much of panic on the ground. And your list, Ramesh, where India flights itself goes up to 6th of March. So I think it's going to be gradual heralding of the tensions over a period of time. It could expand, but people on the ground are not too much in panic. They understand academic institutions will be impacted over a period of time, so students and teachers will have to leave. But it's going to be very gradually unfolding, and that is the trend right from beginning. Whether you look at this crisis or you look at Putin's career of 21 years.
Fair enough.